Well, Velina Maike Aloha, what an action-packed morning. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Okay, so all of us are in for a treat. And it is my honor to introduce these amazing wahine. And you know, last night, Alana was like, you better memorize everything. I'm like, no, I don't want to mess anything up, okay? Let's put it that way. So I'm gonna try my best here to introduce these wonderful panelists. Dr. Shawn Kanaʻiaupuni from Pupukea, Oahu, a proud Kamehameha Schools alumna. She serves currently as the president and CEO of Partners in Development Foundation, a Hawaiian nonprofit organization that serves vulnerable youth and families and ohana across the Pai'aina. Dr. Kanaʻiaupuni has spent more than 20 years of her experience in collaboratively mobilizing public, private, community agencies toward positive education outcomes for Native Hawaiian keiki. At Kamehameha Schools, she managed and implemented several initiatives, including launching its Research Evaluation Division, overseeing public education and charter school programs, leading strategic planning, and execution of a multitude of projects. Her published research examines culture-based education and Hawaiian student outcomes, place and identity, and the success of Native Hawaiian keiki in our public schools. She is a passionate volunteer crew member of the Polynesian Voyaging Society and serves as a trustee of the Queen's Medical Health Systems and the director of the boards of Hawaii's Association for Nonprofit Organizations. And I have the pleasure of introducing, you know, she was a former colleague of mine, always looked up to her, read all of her research, kind of stalked her a little bit, but you know, so Dr. Shawn Kanaʻiaupuni, mahalo for being here this morning. Our second panelist is Kalā Babayan Tanaka. Kalā is a recent master's program graduate at UH Manoa STEMS with Carmen and my wife, Alana, and is responsible for education direction and program implementation at the Hui o Wa'a Kaulua, a voyaging nonprofit organization here on the island of Maui. She is a mother of three, a wife, a daughter, and sister that is fed by her kupuna. Moana nui a Kea, the waters of Kahoma, Aina kupuna of Paunau Lahaina, and Pu'u Pa'u Pa'u. Kalā studied voyaging and navigation under her father, late Master Navigator Kalapa Babayan, since 2006. She continues to practice and carry on his legacy. She crewed and co-navigated on various legs of the Malama Honua voyage all around the world and voyaged to places like Tahiti, Rarotonga, Virginia, New York, the whole gamut, right? She's an educator, and why she decided to become an educator and pursued a path of higher education. We don't all learn the same way, as she says. I am a perfect example of that because I couldn't learn astronomy within the traditional four walls, but put me on a canoe and taught me how to use the whole ku to find the way, and now you've got all of my attention because this is where I thrive. And again, I'm honored to introduce Kalā. I was thinking about this as Kaleko was talking earlier. It was her father that introduced me for the very first time when I was at University of Hawaii at Hilo to Mauna Kea and Kiana Kakoi and the significance of that amazing Mauna, and got to not necessarily sail to Tahiti with him, but got to sail around Hilo Bay a number of times. And so just honored that the both of you could be here this morning and sharing your mana'o about Hawaiian education. Mahalo.
Wow, thank you for that wonderful introduction. A little long. I'm going to send a shorter one next time. You can read it. Aloha mai kako, everyone. Thank you so much for this time. I'm really excited to be here and was so honored to be invited, you know, as a Kamehameha alum, and really I love the way how they said it in the last panel, that whatever I say today is your own fault because you made me. No, I'm just kidding. As a caveat, no. But I appreciate all of you and the hard work that you're doing and the fact that you are with our haumana every single day. And that comes with a lot of kuleana that I know that you feel. And that's why you're here. And so this is really an important day to kick off the rest of the year. I'm so excited for you all. And I'm going to try not to look backwards, but every so often I have to check where I am, so don't mind me. And I also wrote down my comments because I don't want to go too long. I want to make sure I leave Kalā some time. I'm going to talk at the kind of the stratosphere level, and she's going to talk at the, kind of bringing it home to what does this mean on Earth. And I debated a lot about what to present today. I talked to Kehao a few times. I was like, okay, where are you guys in the process? And I decided, rather than talking about the how, because you have people here on the ground who can do that, they know how, I would talk about the what and the why. And so that's what I'm going to do today, and I hope it's relevant to you. I'm happy to engage with any questions. And I also left some articles, or they're in the Google folder, with the research that backs and substantiates in some ways what I'm going to be saying today. Fair? Is that okay? Okay, right on. So across the world, Indigenous communities like ours in Hawaii have sought to reclaim and restore our languages, our knowledge systems, our values and practices, and in so doing, improve the educational successes of our Indigenous and all students, while ensuring our survival as a unique culture here in Hawaii. So you know the statistics, right? Let's just look at them for a minute. Most people know Hawaii as a paradise. But right now, K-12 DOE student enrollment in Hawaii is 213,000 or so. 85% are in public schools, 5% of those are in public charter schools, 15% in private schools, and a large portion of that 15% is Kamehameha. You graduate 700 haumana a year, which is, I think Hawaii doesn't know what's going to happen to them next because they got 700 OEV leaders coming out every year, and that's the kuleana of today. That's why we're talking about this today. You also have 25% of the DOE population, or a little higher, are Native Hawaiian, and about 10% of the teachers, just so you know. I don't know what it looks like here on this campus, but hopefully a little better. And in public schools, we know that our Native Hawaiians' aggregate student achievement lags up to 30 percentile points behind other ethnic groups. And that we have some of the lowest high school graduation rates in the state, with 1 in 5 actually not completing on time. That's 1 in 5 not completing high school, right? And then half as many are completing a 2 or 4 year college degree. So there's a lot of work to do. And again, that puts Kamehameha schools in a very unique place. So imagine this scenario. Imagine sending your child off to school. You probably have some kids, knowing that today he'll be learning about mud, what's in it, what it's made of, where it comes from, and his whole class is really excited to be exploring a special marsh where they'll get to feel it, maybe look at it through a microscope, learn about its healing properties, what grows in it, what kinds of species rely on it, and also learn about why it's unhealthy and in critical need of restoration, that mud. He's also been learning traditional stories from a kupuna to prepare them for this day, and who told them about today's mud and how it traces back to an ancient edible mud called lepo'ai that was spiritually and physically purifying. And not only did the gods eat it, but so did the most brilliant princess of the land. And she owned many lands through her royal grandfather and cousins, and passed on the wealth from these lands to all her people to serve a special mission, to build schools and to educate. And today, thousands of Native children and families get to learn because of those lands. Yes, Native Hawaiian, haumana. And your child was so excited. He's like, came home talking all about it that day, the princess who ate mud. And it's all part of the school's next-gen science standards, relationships and ecosystems, environmental impacts on organisms. Or he could learn mud that way, or Or he could show up in a classroom and read a textbook paragraph about soil, watch a video, fill out a worksheet, and because he's your child and he's super smart, he would finish early and the teacher would ask him to draw quietly because he always finishes before his classmates and gets kind of bored. So, be quiet and don't worry, recess coming soon. It could be that. So, there's Aleppo. This should trigger in your mind for all of us, like, I want the first scenario, not the second. And the second scenario is why I took my daughter out of a DOE kindergarten and put her into an immersion, Kanaʻiaupuni, actually a Hawaiian medium charter school, sorry, Kamako. But the point is that for all of us, probably, the optimal learning environments for Indigenous students and all of us connect us to a deep sense of place, to our values, to our languages, to our traditions, our community, and to spirituality. Yes, spirituality in education. Teaching and learning through Indigenous knowledge revitalizes languages, knowledge, practices, and beliefs that have been lost or suppressed through colonization or occupation. And you all know the colonization and occupation story of Hawaii that lives on in the DNA of our people. It's genetically transferable through the generations. There's biological research that proves that now. We knew it always in our na'au. But my daughter's a biologist and she tells me it's so. I don't argue with that one. In Hawaii, culture-based education reform, which you've heard about from the last panel, thank you, they set us up so wonderfully, has been an organic solution to the chilling negative solutions that plague Native Hawaiian children today. High rates of poverty, domestic violence, substance abuse, justice entanglement, as well as sizable disparities in educational outcomes, depression, suicide ideation, and suicide trends. And actually, the highest rates of suicide among Native Hawaiians today are in the 10 to 14-year-old age range. It's very troubling. In Western education, but Indigenous science, let's talk about Western science and Indigenous science. It engages your brain, your heart, your spirit. There are ties to the future through a relationship with the past. That's Kiana Frank, she's a KS grad too, a really amazing biologist. And she says, if you believe that you are physically related to the earth, you're gonna take care of it, you're gonna protect it. And so that's important. In Western education, I don't know about here, because I haven't been in your classrooms. I'm hoping this isn't so. But Indigenous identity is seen as a barrier to overcome for students. It comes with deficits. But what if Indigenous identity is a cultural advantage? What if it's a superpower? Which I really think it is. Indigenous education builds identity and kuleana, with keen attention to community and the relationships between humanity, our land, our seas, the skies. And we have to realize that, first, that all education is culture-based. All education is culture-based. It's usually, but whose culture? Whose knowledge is it based on? That's the question. And if culture is very simply ways of knowing, being, and doing of a cultural group, then culture-based education, because I want you to be able to articulate that when people ask you, is teaching and learning evolving from, but not limited to, so it's not just about going out in the lo'i, even though that's important, evolving from the languages, values, norms, knowledges, beliefs, practices, experiences, and places that are foundational to an Indigenous or cultural group. It could be Jewish, it could be Japanese, it could be Hawaiian, it could be Navajo, it could be Yurok. I met with some Yurok folks last night. They're here in Maui looking to support Native Hawaiian access to our lands. Super cool. So that's what culture-based education is. It's pretty simple when you get right down to it. And as Indigenous peoples, the political part, which you've heard a lot about this morning, which is super critical to the why. Why should KS think about Hawaiian CBE? Why is it important to us? Well, we acknowledge that as Indigenous peoples, our approach to culturally based education, because there's a lot of research on culturally relevant and resonant and sustaining education out there among Black, Latino, and other peoples of color. But in Indigenous education, our approach to CBE recognizes, first of all, that educational systems are sites for power negotiation and potential liberation, not just of individuals, but entire communities and families and nations. That knowledge tied to culture and language and place are critical building blocks to our identity, to our self-determination as Kanaka. That the educational outcomes we expect and measure should be those that are useful and meaningful to local Indigenous communities. Now that's a new one for our trustees. I say our because I worked at Kanaʻiaupuni for 20 years, right? So can I just do that? Is that okay? Sorry. And this means teaching and learning about and through Indigenous knowledge, models, methods, and content within formal and informal curriculum and instruction. So the about and through is important because it's not only about our Hawaiian history and knowledge, which is super cool and amazing, but how do we use cultural approaches as the through, as the way we build pilina with our students, as the way we aloha them when they come on this campus, as the way we welcome their ohana as part of the teaching and learning process, as the way we expect their commitment and kuleana to community and build that in them every day. So Indigenous education then taps into funds of knowledge, what other researchers have called funds of knowledge, Lewis Mall and counterparts in our communities, in our students. It creates greater equity because the world is an unequal place. And in stark contrast to common deficits-oriented approaches, it's not something to overcome, it's based on our strengths. And when we as educators, we all, reframe Indigenous identities as sources of cultural advantage, actually a competitive advantage, a superpower, we are shifting power and equity imbalances by giving voice to the expertise of our elders and sources of cultural knowledge in our communities, our families, our individuals. We're meeting students and families at their starting point and building from there. And so this campus especially is educating Hawaiians, and we know that the kuleana of those Hawaiians is about this place, our culture, our language, and protecting it, so you want them to be kia'i, and going out into the world and sharing their gifts, because Hawaii has plenty of gifts for the world to learn about. So the so what, what do we know? There's been some research, it's been published in journals. There's a lot more than when I did some publications, but we did, one of the articles talks about a big research project that we did in Hawaii with 60 schools, public-private charter, including Kamehameha, about 600 kumu and thousands of children. And we found over and over again a very consistent and enduring positive effect of using culture-based education to a high degree on student outcomes. That's the short and long of it in very simple language. This was the framework that we built, and the article is available to you. You don't have to buy the journal article. I just, don't tell anyone. I stole it. It's mine, right? I wrote it. Me and a bunch of other people who are awesome, my colleagues. So this is an example of how culture-based or students who come from teachers who use they self-reported, all the teachers in the study self-reported their extent of using culture-based approaches. The ones that reported a high use of CBE, the students reported feeling trusting people in their school, thinking that their teachers go out of their way to help them, and that many of the people in their school are like family to them. And so the high CBE teachers is the lighter line, and the low CBE teachers is the darker line. So that was a good thing to learn about. And also, students with teachers who are high CBE users were more connected to their culture. They had a stronger sense of cultural identity. They were more connected to school and felt that sense of belonging, positive relationships at their school and with their school, college aspirations and expectations to graduate from college. And they were connected to their community. They actually knew more about the places and about their community, and they were civically engaged. So they had been active in their community, not just once, because we looked at more than once, but more than once in their, whether it was in a protest or environmental stewardship. And actually some of the research that has been done by other kumu using the data find that actually the political activism was really a strong point in academic success and political cultural identity of their haumana. So just so you know, there's some research out there. How do I click on that link? Can I just show you one thing? And there's a positive effect on academics as well, and I just wanted to show you this little video to give a sense of it, of this young woman here. She's probably like, I don't know how old she is now. Oh, I can do it? There you go. So if you scroll down, yeah, click on that one. It's really short. Thank you.
My school teaches me to see for myself. I used to think I didn't like school, but now I know school is much more than I thought, and the classroom is everywhere. When I look at the ocean, I see math and science. When I look at the aina, I see technology and art. When I look at our culture, I see it all.
Just a little example about the academic connections that are incredibly powerful through culture-based education. And I won't go on about that right now, but we can talk story after if you want. So what do we need? I'm gonna go here. We need policies. We need authentic assessments and research from an Indigenous standpoint. So more research that builds on the how we do it and what we measure and how we get stronger and better. Because by now, we should be getting stronger and better on this voyage that we're on at Kamehameha schools and our charter schools and our immersion schools. So the research to me is all about how, under what conditions is it most successful, and how do our students flourish? How do our families flourish? And we need the authentic and assessment and research from an Indigenous standpoint that the state and feds will recognize and accept. And as a private partner, KS has made strides as a backbone support for 17 Hawaiian-focused charter schools that probably wouldn't be where they are today without the help of KS. And they're all public schools, and they also collaborated to develop a state-accepted readiness tool that looks at college readiness and performance-based assessments using student mastery and 21st century skills. And that has gained some national attention. They've been invited to share across the nation. We need policies in support of systems change so that more of our haumana, all of our haumana, should have access to the brilliance of their culture, of our ancestors, of our knowledge, and any student from this place. The culture of this place is Hawaiian. The other folks before this talked a lot about systems change, so I'm not going to go into that. But really good things happening. We need greater support for our Hawaiian language revitalization. It feels pa'a, but it's not. It's very fragile. We have brought it back from the brink of extinction, and it's growing every year, which is amazing on the scale of things. Hawaii is one of 2 U.S. states recognizing Indigenous language as an official language, and Indigenous languages are becoming extinct every day. Like, it's really critical across the world. Honolulu Magazine reported that Hawaiian language immersion schools are among the programs that inspire students beyond test scores and making the grade. They inspire them and motivate them for so much more. We've seen continued growth in Native Hawaiian immersion education, as some of the colleagues earlier said. With over 3,000 students enrolled in 2019 and 24 immersion schools statewide, and that's a 10% increase over the prior year to that, and a 30% increase from 4 years prior to that. So there's been a steep increase, and over 10 years, a doubling of the numbers. But in spite of the doubling, the budget has reduced by half, and so that's important. We need to be advocates. We need to help with training teachers to be educators in Hawaiian language. So now what? Why does this all matter? What do we do now? Well, so the bottom line is that Indigenous education powers up self-determination, identity, and opportunities for our haumana to become change agents, right? That's our mission here. Change agents for good. And to achieve greater equity, it's critical that we strengthen CBE systems and transitions in education from pre-K to K-12 to post-secondary and workforce. That it exists in some places, but certainly not across the board. And again, just a shout out to Kamehameha Schools for their role in supporting Kanaʻiaupuni with 80 plus organizations that are devoted to Hawaiian education, creating that Hawaiian system, education system based on Olelo Hawaii and Ike Hawaii. So we need to build networks of Indigenous schools, organizations, strengthen through collaboration and partnerships. And the now what too is about OEV leaders taking action, and we see it throughout. We've always seen the earlier question about what is the impact of RKS alumni. RKS alumni have been leading change forever, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, now. And we should be proud of that and encourage that and celebrate that and think about what more do we need? What's the next step? How do we go even farther? I'll just say, one example of that transition, my daughter, I am a researcher. I experimented with my 2 children. I sent one to Punahou and one to Hawaiian immersion at Kekula Kamakau. And my younger daughter just recently graduated from college. She is majored in biology and minored in chemistry at Columbia, and has recently come home and is planning to go to graduate school. And I just, I asked her the other day, I'm like, so how did your beginning at Kekula Kamakau prepare you for where you are? How does it matter to you today as you think about your future? And she just, she just said, and it was really quick too. She's like, it's like a tree. I'm a tree. And my roots are deeply embedded in that kahua of Olelo Hawaii, of culture and art and science through Hawaiian eyes and our aina, the relationships with our aina. And she said, I'm growing my tree and I'm sprouting the leaves, and each step in my educational journey is more leaves, more branches, and I can reach out far into the world, and the flowers and the blossoms that are produced from that in that journey. And then they drop to the ground, and that's how I give back to my lahui, because it's always about Hawaii, about our Kanaka, about our lahui, no matter where she goes. And she can go far and wide. She, with her degree, and actually her senior thesis we found out was published in an article, and then she's part of an NSF grant. I don't know how she got so smart, but whatever. I don't tell her that very often because big head, huh? But she's a hard worker. They created a hard worker, that immersion school education, one who's very good at listening because a lot of it is oral. One is good at kilo because it's always about keen observation. So she's a great biologist, naturally. It's in her DNA, right? And she wants to study genetic research. She's very interested in the transmission of historical trauma through our genes and through the expression of genetic code. And she's going to study diabetes in Hawaiians, and has landed on some really cutting edge ways to kind of reverse the cycle that her, biology professor, who's the department head of her school, thought was really cool. So I'm excited for her. I'm like, you got to go back to grad school. You cannot get stuck here, girl. But she is. She says, I know, but she just loves Hawaii so much she doesn't want to leave. So that's the sacrifice. She was in New York for 4 years. And it was painful for her. So that's who we're sending off. We're saying, go away, go learn, and come back. But it's know that builds its own trauma, right? And we have to nurture our babies when we send them away. So that's my Moleolani story. But we've seen successes. That was the Kanaʻiaupuni story. We've seen successes in Indigenous education as decades of sustained effort, especially in the last 20 years, have led to a deepened sense of collective efficacy in our communities. You can see it. You can see it in our haumana that are fighting for food sovereignty and sustainability, in fighting for language revitalization, in fighting for protecting our sacred places, in protecting our water. They're at Red Hill, and in fighting for climate change around the world. A few years ago, some Hawaiians had this audacious goal to connect with people in places around the world by sailing with no modern instruments, just native intelligence, and I know you know about that story, and I was very blessed to be part of the crew. And I look up to Kalā because she has so much to teach me. I'm like her student, and wanted to give her a chance to share. But the Malama Honua Worldwide Voyage was just this amazing example of culture-based education, of indigenous education on a global scale. Taking the gift of Hawaii, how we understand aloha and our kinship to place and people in caring for the earth, and weave that lay of hope all around the world so that other people understand the urgency of caring for our oceans and the plankton that give us breath every day and their survival, which thank goodness for COVID, because I think they're a little healthier now. We're maybe less healthier, but they're a little healthier. Sorry, I didn't say thank goodness for COVID. Sorry, I don't mean that. But it came with a lot of pain too. But the earth, I think, we saw some incredible flourishing that gives us a lot of lessons, a lot of understanding of what it takes to really reverse climate change, the impact of climate change. And the main lesson there is that life on a canoe is like life on an island, right? Scarce resources, finite resources, precious people, team members, which is like life on Earth, and we need to take care of it. So as educators, my final closing remark, it is our kuleana to revitalize and sustain Hawaiian culture through education and to recognize the gifts of our ancestral knowledge and culture that create a better society for all people, not just us, not just Hawaiians, for everybody. And so I want to give it over to Kalā, who's going to share her story of culture-based education and what it meant to her.
Mahalo. And I just have to say, I just finished a program, as you've heard, UH Manoa College of Education, and we read your articles, and I was like, oh my gosh, I sail with her. But just to share a little bit of my personal story, and I hear it through your daughter's story as well, but when I was going to school, I graduated from Kealakahe High School on Hawaii Island, and I would consider myself like an average student. And when I thought about science and math, I thought, I'm not good at that. And for me, it was because I felt that I couldn't relate. I couldn't understand it. And it wasn't until I was, there we go. It wasn't until I was out of high school, and you might have heard a little bit earlier too, my relationship to voyaging is actually through my father, who's a captain and navigator. But growing up, we never went sailing. We sent him off. We were his support. And so there was really only so much that I knew about voyaging. So again, after high school and I started going to college, that was when I became personally more interested in my identity of who I was as a Hawaiian. I was really trying to figure that out. It was one part of the many parts that make up myself. And so I started to take language classes, as well as Hawaiian studies. And Kalā was actually my first Hawaiian language teacher. And while I was going through that, this started to pique my interest as like, so what is it like? And through my father, I get this one opportunity. He had just finished building a voyaging canoe on the island of Hawaii Island Hilo called Hokualaka'i. And they were gonna sail that canoe from Oahu to Maui. And so I had this opportunity to sail with him. I was totally freaked out, scared, because I was just learning language, and I knew that these guys on the canoe, that's all they did, Olelo Hawaii. So I was like, how am I gonna do? But I went. And as we were underway, in the back behind us, we can see Mokauea Island just kind of fading off, and I'm realizing that I can do this, and that these people on the canoe, they were a family, they were ohana, and it didn't matter that I was still learning my language. I was in an ohana and they were there to support me. And I could learn the language, and I could learn by watching as well too. And I realized that actually all of us were learning. And as we were getting underway, my father would talk about the swells, and he would talk about how we recognize the swells and how these swells can orient ourselves in our space and lead us to where we need to go. We could use that as a way to orient us in the direction that we want to go. And this was mind-blowing to me because I never learned this in school. And then at night, when the stars came out, he told us who they were. They all had a name. They had a purpose for the same reason. They were helping to orient us where we were in our place. They were helping us to understand where we were in our place so we could navigate from one place to the next. And that was mind-blowing because I never learned that in school. And then at 2 o'clock, it was early in the morning. It felt like 2 o'clock in the morning. He tells me, "Do you hear that?" And I hear the wind and I hear the swells and I have no idea what he's talking about, that he hears something else. So he takes me to the front of the canoe, and at the very front of the canoe at the manu, I hear it. And he could hear the dolphins breathing as they were swimming with us and the canoe was sailing. And that was it. That was, when you catch a fish and it hook on the line. Yeah, that was me. And I was like, this is insane that you know this, that my ancestors know this, that you're doing this, because I never learned this kind of stuff. Anyways, so when we got to land, I was like, how do I learn more? And he told me, go find your canoe. And so I did. He was living on Hawaii Island. I was living here on Maui. And I found my canoes, Mo'okiha, Opi'ilani, Mo'olele. Mo'okiha was still being built. So I started at the bottom, sanding, sweeping, shooting off the canoe. That's where I started. And I'm so happy that I started there because I learned how to take care of a canoe. I learned how it worked. And through that, we had voyaging ohana, as well as here on the island, coming through. And all of these kupuna all have stories. We have kupuna that come from Nukuhiva, and they bring their stories. We have kupuna here on Maui, and they share their stories. And it's that intergenerational learning that's also part of my process, and Kanaka methodology that is just so important. But I never learned that in the traditional school, and I'm only learning it now. So fast forward to 2014, this was my first long voyage to Tahiti, and I actually wasn't the first pick, I was an alternate. And at the very last minute, somebody couldn't go, and so they called me, and I was like, yes, I'm going. And my job was apprentice navigator, but also education specialist. So I was also in charge of taking care of the science experiments on board. And there's something that happens when you are cut off from everything else and you're on this va'a, just you and your crew with your master navigator, immersed in this environment. It feels like space-time travel. That's how all of this focused and deep learning. By the time we got to Tahiti, I was like a changed person. But what I felt, the strong overwhelming feeling that I felt was kuleana. And it was like, if I take this and I do nothing with it, just like in the poho for nothing. And so I knew that my responsibility was to come back home and to share it and teach it and to create more new opportunities for other haumana to experience this too. And I mahalo Kamehameha Schools Maui because in 2017, we piloted the first Papa Ho'okele. This is them right there. It is 2022, so it's been, in my mind, I say 6 generations, 6 classes. A generation's a little bit longer than that, but in my mind, that's how I think. And just this year, one of the haumana in that class, since that first Papa Ho'okele, he's continued, he's got a great mentor himself too, his brother, who's also a captain of our canoe. But he was one of the main guys that facilitated the sails so that we could take haumana, come out and sail. Another haumana in that Papa Ho'okele too, we had the opportunity to do a ship-to-shore kind of crew talk with her. And she's an intern, at that time she was an intern doing surveying work at Johnston Atoll. And that is just amazing stuff to see that I can say, wow, they were in the Papa Ho'okele voyaging class. But you know what I mean? It's not about one and done, but it continues, right? It's all about, like you said, going back and giving back to your community. But I just wanted to share that. So maybe even a call to action, right? You have resources within your community. It's that resource mapping. Who are those people within your community that know? It's okay to not know everything. There is so much joy in learning alongside with your students as well too. So it's finding them and how do you begin to start that pilina? How can you possibly think of ways that could we invite them in, maybe do a co-teaching session, learning, because I don't have all the answers as well too. And there's a lot of learning that can happen both ways. But yes, thank you. Mahalo. Mahalo, everyone.
No laila. Mahalo. Mahalo nui. We still have some time and would love to open it up for some questions and answers for these lovely ladies. I know that they're biting at the bit to just hear some of your mana'o. And, like Kalā had said, I think definitely something that resonates, I think all of us today, is that, we don't have all the answers. And, as we embark or continue our journey along Hawaiian culture-based education, that it's okay to learn alongside our students. I think that's where a lot of that ike comes along, and I think there's something about that, right? When you learn alongside of your haumana and the pilina that it builds. So, he mana'u ka'oko, he mauni nau ka'oko. Any questions, mana'o? Dr. Jan Lucier, I am sure you have something to ask. Come on. And I'm happy to come around and bring the mic so you don't have to come up here. So, Mahila hila, don't be shy. As my mom always said, if you shame, you starve. So let's go. Come on. Hawai mana'o. Questions? Kyle? Nobody?
It was so perfectly clear, like chocolate.
Well, I know. Okay, go.
So really, no questions, comments, stories. I do want to say that coming from having worked with a lot of educators and a lot of different kinds of systems, that sometimes it may seem overwhelming, and like, how do we get this done? And that's the next step, right? Is to reach out. We were talking about this on the phone, and I was like, should we talk about the how, or should I talk about the what and the why? But reach out to your community, reach out to your families and your communities, make a friend. That's why I brought Kalā. She's right here. Ask, because it's okay to not know. A'o aku, a'o mai, right? We're teaching and learning. It's a give and take relationship. Very, Piaget, very, lots of good learning, cognitive learning theory there. And that's the best way to start.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
I think one of the questions I've been thinking about, and you were talking about assessments earlier, and through the work that you have done, Shawn, over the last 2-3 decades, has really not just focused on research and data, but also the assessment piece. And I think that's a lot of times where maybe we as educators, we kako, we struggle with that and tend to depend on outside, for creating those assessments. And I don't know if you want to talk maybe a little bit more about that and how we can empower ourselves as educators and learners to be able to create some of those type of assessments ourselves, to be able to collect the data ourselves and rely on that. That's unique to not just our campus or our community, but our overall maybe organization. Because I know that you've spent a lot of time doing that. So maybe share a little bit, if you don't mind.
I think that's a really good question about assessments, and the idea that we rely so heavily on test scores and GPA as measures of accomplishment in a school is something that we want to challenge. And especially now, what we're seeing with COVID, with high kind of social isolation and loneliness and depression among our young people. I was just talking to a group of probation officers, and they said they are seeing more and more kids with subacute and acute mental health needs, and we don't have a lot of services here in Hawaii for them. So when we think about what it is that we should be measuring in school, I would say, we should rely on our gut, on our Indigenous knowledge, and think about what are the outcomes. This is why I got into the research with charter schools to begin with, because they were saying there's nothing out there that measures what we're educating for. It's all about the test scores and these norm reference standards. We're looking at creating young people who understand their connection to community, who understand their connection to family, who understand what the aina, how to protect the aina and how to care for it, and who take care of our language and steward our resources well. And if you think about who you want to be left on a desert island with, right? I always say, like, is it the person who got the highest map score, or is it the one who understands how to rebuild and how to fish, how to farm, and so on. And so I think the trick, so what we ended up doing is creating a research project where we identified the outcomes that were important to them, those things that I had just mentioned, and we began measuring them. And sometimes the qualitative is an even more powerful kind of assessment than the quantitative. And you can use visual assessments now. I just got back from a conference in Seattle where there was a big funder and philanthropy foundation circle, and they're very focused now on measuring belonging, connection, meaning, purpose as outcomes in education. Imagine that. I mean, that's what it's all about, right? The test scores come after those things happen. The engagement in knowledge and academic knowledge comes after we've engaged kids. So I think relying on our instincts, and like the charter schools did with creating the 21st century mastery and performance measures that were then state approved. That's an example of what you can do, what we can do. And you have Aola learner outcomes, which are incredibly powerful and cutting edge, if that's what you're really doing. But how do you measure them? That's the trick, right? So there is work to be done, and it's not easy work. It does take persistence and effort, but it can be done. Yeah.
So you got a question over. Yes.
I just had a comment. Like, did I see right that there's not any Hawaiian focused charter school in Maui? It looked like there's like 7 on the Big Island and 1 on Molokai, but
Yeah, I think. Yeah, in the last 20 years, there have been a couple that have tried and want to. I think there's some communities that want to, but they haven't yet been able to. So yeah. Thank you.
I have a question, comment. I don't really know what it is. It's on it. First say mahalo, and I keep staring at this picture. So I think it was 2017.
Yes, 2017.
And I mean, my son's in there, and my whatever online kids and all that stuff. But when we take the kids out of the classroom and we throw them in a situation where they're forced to engage in something else,
Hi.
then you see massive change. And you talked about that on your first long voyage. So I guess my question is, how do we create more opportunities like that that are not just in a summer program or in like Halal's doing great things during the summer and intercession and winter, all that stuff. But how do we make that real for all of our kids? Like when I say all, the narrative with the dialogue, I should say, between Kanaʻiaupuni and Kanaʻiaupuni is a long overdue should stop dialogue. Mm-hmm. It's all of our kuleana. Mm-hmm. So how do we make all of that happen? Mm-hmm. We have our own law, and I'm not just saying that the law is the only way. Mm-hmm. The law is one way. We have no other farms. We have tons of different. But how do we make that real for all of us? Mm-hmm. All our kids get out of the classrooms.
Hi.
It's just, where do we see 30 years from now? Like Kalā is right, but it's a struggle. So when is the struggle going to get easier? Mm-hmm. And when is the crew through Pilina going to be in sync? And what else can we do to push the buttons to make it happen now and not wait 30 years? So that we actually see something happen in 30 years? So I think that's the start, but when does it happen and what do we do? I mean, what do you guys think that we should be doing today, tomorrow, to make these realities part of our reality now?
Yeah. And I'll ask Shawn as well too, to Ka'ako'o as well. I know from my part in doing education to the Huiwa a Kaulua, like we just need the invitation. Yeah, we're ready. We're ready. I mean, my experience is right. I would think sometimes for the teachers it might be hard without getting the administration on board. Perhaps some professional development to really experience what it is that students would be learning. Because for me, and this is absolutely true, there is va'a, but there is our culture is this prism of colors. There's so much, and so I can only speak from my experience on the va'a. But on the va'a, things like math and science are not siloed. It's transdisciplinary. Our kupuna, they're all there. It's transdisciplinary. Everything interweaves and works together, and so to have that opportunity available for haumana, I mean, think about how that will impact the learner. And beyond school, like enduring understandings-wise. It isn't the first time that I've heard multiple ways of knowing are really important. That's what their leaders of tomorrow need. They can't just think one way. And I think that's like the treasure, or not even the treasure, but that is what we have. Indigenous knowledge is all about multiple ways of knowing. But I would just say, like, I'm kind of going off on another tangent, but I guess the invitation and getting your that admin on board. Yeah, and yeah, Shawn, you're the.
I mean, those are wise words, and I think the research is also consistent there, where we find the most significant and enduring effects, and these are in the regression models and stuff, where the entire school is culture-based, where there's fidelity across the different levels from administrator to kumu to students. So that's something to think about, and how do you? I mean, that's your question, right? How do you move forward as a school, as a community? We're here to help. If we can do anything, yeah, the invitation is the start.
No laila, ya oko. He wahi mahalo ke ia, ya kauka, Shawn, Kanaʻiaupuni, Kalā, Tanaka, and just the ike papalua, not just the ike ku'una and the ike Hawaii, but the ike papalua, that depth of ike that they bring forth, and the kupuna that they have been inspired by. We express our deepest gratitude to the both of you, not just for coming here today and presenting, but really sharing your wealth of knowledge and depth to all of us here at A'apueo at Kamehameha. So again, on behalf of myself and Kamehameha Schools Maui at A'apueo, mahalo ya olua. Thank you. Mahalo. Round of applause.